Amahle woke up before sunrise every morning, tying her faded headscarf and picking up the broom that had become her companion. The streets of Durban were already alive with noise, buses honking, traders setting up stalls, and school children rushing past. As she swept the pavements, pushing away dust and trash, she carried herself with a calm grace. But every day, whispers and laughter followed her. Some called her low class, others sneered and asked why someone so young would waste her life sweeping streets. She heard their words, felt the sting, but never answered back. Instead, she bent her head and kept working, determined to hold her dignity in silence. This morning was no different. Groups of well-dressed people hurried by, barely glancing at her except to wrinkle their noses. Yet, Amale's movements were steady, her broom sliding across the ground with quiet rhythm. She had learned to ignore the stares, to block out the cruel words because deep inside she knew the truth. Her work mattered. Without her, the streets would remain filthy, yet no one ever stopped to thank her. As she reached the busy intersection, a group of youths gathered nearby. They pulled out their phones, pointing and giggling as she bent to pick up an empty bottle. Their laughter grew louder, echoing against the walls. One boy mocked her posture, another pretended to sweep the ground, making the others double over in amusement. People walking past joined in with chuckles, as if her labor was nothing more than a joke. But Amahle did not break. She straightened slowly, dust clinging to her uniform, and looked ahead without a word. Her eyes carried a quiet strength, refusing to give them the satisfaction of her pain. She turned back to her broom, sweeping with the same steady hands, as though their laughter was nothing but wind passing by. The youths, sensing her silence, took it as a challenge. One began recording on his phone, zooming in as they mocked louder. Yet Amahle remained calm, her face showing no anger, no shame. She chose dignity over reaction. The crowd's laughter filled the air, but her silence carried more weight than any insult could. After long hours of sweeping the streets, Amahle walked back to her tiny home on the edge of Durban. The narrow pathway was lined with shacks, laundry hanging between poles, and children playing with old tires. When she opened the wooden door, a wave of warmth and responsibility washed over her. Inside, her frail grandmother lay on a thin mattress, coughing softly while her younger brother, barely 12, sat by her side, doing homework under the dim light of a single bulb. Amal's tired eyes softened at the sight. She placed her broom against the wall, removed her worn shoes, and went straight to the stove to prepare supper. Her salary was small, barely enough to cover food and medicine, yet she stretched every coin with care. Some days she ate less, so her brother could have enough for school. She washed her grandmother's face gently, whispering reassuring words, even when she worried if they would make it to the next month. To the outside world, she was just a street cleaner mocked for her uniform. But to her family, she was their hope, their strength, their lifeline. At night, Amahle often sat by the window with her brother's school books in her hands. She had always dreamed of becoming a teacher, of standing in front of a classroom filled with eager children. But the reality was harsh. School fees were far beyond her reach. Each time she passed by the university on her way to work, she felt a pang in her chest, wondering if her dream would ever come true. Still, she did not allow despair to consume her. She reminded herself that her job, no matter how mocked, was sacred because it kept her family alive. Every broom stroke on the street was another meal for her brother, another dose of medicine for her grandmother. It was not pride in the job itself, but pride in the purpose it served. Amale's struggle was heavy, but she carried it with silent courage. The world saw only a poor street cleaner, but within the walls of her humble home, she was a provider, a dreamer, and a protector of the people she loved most. The morning sun rose high over Durban, casting golden light on the busy streets. Amahle pushed her broom steadily along the pavement, sweeping away plastic wrappers and dust as the city roared to life. Taxis honked impatiently, traders shouted out prices, and people hurried past, too focused on their own lives to notice her presence. She kept her head low, her movements calm, blending into the rhythm of the city. But as she reached the corner near a crowded intersection, something caught her eye. In the middle of the road stood an elderly man with dark glasses and a white cane trembling in his hand. He tapped the ground nervously, trying to find his way across, but the traffic around him surged like waves. Drivers leaned on their horns angrily, swerving past him, while pedestrians rushed by without stopping. Some even stared but quickly turned their heads, unwilling to interrupt their busy schedule. Amahle froze for a moment, her broom still in her hands. She saw the man's confusion, the slight tremble in his legs as he hesitated in fear. Her heart tightened. Without a second thought, she dropped the broom onto the sidewalk and ran toward him. Her worn shoes slapped against the hot tar as she raised her hand, signaling cars to slow down. A few drivers shouted at her, but she ignored them. "Baba, don't worry, I'll help you," she said gently, reaching for his arm. The man's face softened with relief as he nodded, trusting her guidance. Step by step, she led him carefully across the busy lanes. shielding him from the rush of traffic. She held his hand firmly, her body positioned protectively between him and the cars. Finally, they reached the other side. The man whispered a quiet, "Thank you," his voice breaking with emotion. Amahle smiled warmly and nodded, pressing her lunchbox into his hand without hesitation. "Here, please eat something," she said before stepping back. Onlookers who had ignored him moments earlier now stood frozen, watching in silence. Amahle bent down, picked up her broom again, and returned to her work as though nothing had happened. Amahle tightened her grip on the blind man's arm as the noise of traffic roared around them. Her heart pounded, but she kept her step steady, making sure he felt safe. She walked slightly ahead of him, raising her free hand toward the impatient drivers who slowed just enough to let them pass. Every step was careful, every movement protective, as though she was shielding him from the chaos of the road. The man leaned on her lightly, trusting her completely, and Amahle whispered encouragement with each stride until they reached the other side. Once on the pavement, the man sighed deeply, his shoulders dropping in relief. "Thank you, my child," he said softly, his voice trembling. Amahle smiled warmly, brushing dust from her uniform. She could have walked away then, but something inside her urged her to do more. She reached into her small lunchbox, the one she had packed earlier with a simple sandwich and a piece of fruit meant to last her through the day. Without hesitation, she placed it gently in his hands. "Here, Baba," she said kindly. "Please eat something. I'll be fine." The man's cloudy eyes widened behind his dark glasses. He held the lunchbox carefully as though it was treasure. His lips quivered, unable to form words, but the gratitude in his silence spoke louder than anything. All around them, people who had once hurried past now stood still. Some lowered their heads in shame for ignoring the blind man earlier. Others pulled out their phones, quietly recording the moment. Whispers spread through the crowd about the young street cleaner who had shown more humanity than the hundreds who rushed by. Amahle, unaware of the attention, bent down to pick up her broom from where she had dropped it. She brushed dirt from its handle, then returned to sweeping as if nothing extraordinary had happened. To her, it was simply what anyone with a heart should do. But to the passers-by, it was an act of kindness so pure, it demanded to be remembered. The boys who had spent days mocking Amahle stood frozen, their laughter stuck in their throats. They had lifted their phones once again, ready to record her humiliation, but what they witnessed was nothing they had expected. The same woman they had called low class was now guiding a blind man with such care and dignity that even their mocking grins began to fade. They watched in silence as she handed over her own lunch, her tired face glowing with kindness instead of shame. For the first time, their laughter felt small, powerless against the weight of her humanity. The boy holding the phone lowered it slowly, ashamed of what he had meant to capture. Around them, the crowd that usually ignored Amahle began to clap. It started with one woman at the edge of the pavement, then spread like a wave, until hands from all directions joined in, echoing through the busy street. The applause grew louder than the horns of the taxis, drowning out the chaos of the city. Amahle looked up, startled, realizing the sound was for her. Her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. She was not used to attention. She was used to insults, whispers, and cruel laughter. She quickly bent down, picked up her broom, and brushed off the dust as if nothing had happened. With her head lowered, she returned to sweeping, hoping the noise would die down. But the clapping continued, some people even calling out words of respect. "Well done, Cece," one shouted. "That is true kindness," another added. Amahle shook her head shyly, refusing to meet their eyes. To her, she had only done what was right. She did not see herself as special. What she didn't notice was the quiet buzz of phones recording her every move. Multiple angles of her kindness were being captured, spreading quickly through the hands of strangers who now saw her differently. The same broom that once drew laughter was now a symbol of quiet strength, and the same young woman mocked in silence was about to be celebrated in ways she never imagined. By the time the sun dipped below the Durban skyline, the video of Amahle's simple act had already begun to spread like wildfire. A stranger had uploaded it to social media with the caption, "True kindness still exists." Within hours, it was shared thousands of times. People who had never cared to notice a street cleaner before were now writing messages about her courage and humility. The hashtags Jai Amahle the Helper and Kindness in Action started trending, climbing steadily until they reached the top of the national feed. Clips of her guiding the blind man across the busy intersection played over and over on phones, tablets, and televisions. Some focused on the way she held her arm out protectively, shielding him from cars. Others highlighted the moment she gave away her lunchbox without hesitation. Comments poured in. "This is the real definition of a hero. She deserves respect, not mockery. The world needs more people like her." In offices, buses, and classrooms, people paused their day to watch the young woman in a faded uniform, her broom resting on the sidewalk, as she helped someone no one else would stop for. Many who had once walked past cleaners without a glance now admitted their shame online. Others shared personal stories of their own struggle, saying Amahle gave them hope that dignity and compassion still mattered. As night fell, news outlets picked up the story. Local channels replayed the video, and radio stations discussed the mystery cleaner who had touched the hearts of millions. Commentators called her a symbol of true humanity. Memes and edits turned her image into a beacon of humility, circulating far beyond Durban. Back in her small home, Amahle remained unaware of her sudden fame. She was busy serving supper to her grandmother and brother, laughing gently at her brother's school jokes. To her, it had been just another day of work, another act of doing what was right. But outside those four walls, the girl who had been mocked for her job was now being lifted up by a nation, her kindness shining brighter than any insult ever could. The next morning, Amahle woke to unusual noises outside her small home. When she peeked through the thin curtain, she froze in surprise. Reporters with cameras and microphones stood at her gate calling her name. Neighbors crowded around, whispering excitedly. The once invisible street cleaner was now the center of attention. Her younger brother stared wide-eyed, while her grandmother shook her head in disbelief. Nervously, Amahle stepped outside, smoothing her faded uniform. Flashing cameras immediately clicked, and voices rushed to ask her questions. How did you feel in that moment? Why did you give him your food? Do you realize you've touched the entire country? She looked down shyly, clutching her hands together. I didn't do anything special, she said softly, her voice almost drowned out by the buzz. I just did what anyone with a heart should do. He needed help, and I was there. Her simple words silenced the crowd for a moment before more cameras rolled. By evening, her interview was everywhere, on television, in newspapers, and across online platforms. Headlines praised her humility. Street cleaner teaches a nation about kindness. Talk shows invited guests to discuss her story, and callers phoned in to say how inspired they felt. Some admitted they had mocked people like her before and now felt ashamed. Then, something remarkable began to happen. Strangers who had never met Amahle started sending donations, small amounts at first, enough for food, medicine, and clothes for her family. Soon, larger contributions arrived, some from businesses that wanted to support her. One envelope carried enough money to pay off her grandmother's hospital bills. Another donor promised to cover her brother's school expenses for the next year. Amahle sat in her modest living room, overwhelmed as neighbors read out messages of encouragement sent from across the country. She wiped away tears, struggling to believe this was real. The same broom that once brought her ridicule had unknowingly swept her into the hearts of millions. She had not asked for recognition, yet her quiet act of kindness had opened a floodgate of love and generosity she never imagined. A week later, Amahle received an official letter that made her hands tremble. The city's mayor had invited her to City Hall for a special ceremony. She thought it must be a mistake. Why would someone like her be called to such a grand place? But when she arrived, escorted by city officials, she realized the truth. The wide hall was filled with journalists, community leaders, and residents waiting to see the young woman whose kindness had touched the nation. Amahle entered nervously, her simple dress contrasting sharply with the polished suits and elegant gowns around her. Murmurs spread through the crowd as people recognized her from the viral video. For once, the looks she received were not of mockery but of admiration. She bowed her head slightly, shy under the attention. The mayor rose to the podium, his voice firm yet warm. Ladies and gentlemen, today we honor a young woman who showed us that humanity does not come from wealth or status, but from the heart. Amahle reminded us that true dignity is found in serving others, no matter the job we hold. The room filled with applause as Amahle's name echoed through the chamber. She clutched her hands tightly, fighting back tears. Then the mayor announced something that took her breath away. To support Amahle's dream of becoming a teacher, we are establishing a scholarship fund in her name. This fund will not only cover her education, but also help others like her who work hard but cannot afford to chase their dreams. Gasps of joy rippled across the hall. Amahle covered her mouth, unable to speak as people stood and clapped louder. Her brother and grandmother, seated in the front row, cried openly, their faces glowing with pride. When asked to say a few words, Amahle stepped forward, her voice trembling. I am just a street cleaner who wanted to help someone in need. I never imagined this. I thank you, not for myself, but for showing that kindness still matters. That day, Amal's humility became more than a story. It became a legacy of hope for an entire city. The first day Amahle walked through the university gates, her heart pounded harder than it ever had. She clutched her books tightly against her chest, her uniform replaced by a neat blouse and skirt. The same streets she once swept now led her into lecture halls filled with eager students. At first, she felt out of place, worried people would look at her the same way they once had. But instead of laughter, she was met with smiles and greetings. Some even whispered her name with admiration, recognizing her as the young woman whose kindness had inspired a nation. Though she was now a scholarship student, Amahle still worked part-time as a cleaner in the evening. She refused to let go of the dignity and hard work. After classes, she would put on her gloves, sweep offices, and tidy spaces with the same quiet dedication she had shown on the streets. This balance was not easy. Long nights of study and early mornings of work left her exhausted, but her determination burned stronger than her weariness. Her confidence grew with each passing day. Professors praised her sharp mind, classmates sought her advice, and her voice, once soft and hesitant, began to carry strength when she spoke in class discussions. She no longer lowered her eyes when walking past people. Instead, she looked ahead with purpose. What surprised her most were the faces of those who had once mocked her. Some of the very youths who laughed at her on the street now avoided her gaze in shame. A few even approached her, apologizing for their past cruelty. Amahle responded only with kindness, reminding them that people can always change. At home, her brother proudly told his friends that his sister was becoming a teacher, while her grandmother smiled brighter each day, saying her prayers had been answered. Amahle herself felt a quiet joy. Her dream was no longer just a wish, it was unfolding before her eyes. The girl once ridiculed for sweeping streets was now admired for sweeping away every obstacle with courage and resilience. The morning sun poured through the windows of a small classroom as Amahle stood at the front, chalk in hand, facing rows of eager children. Their eyes sparkled with curiosity, waiting for her words. She took a deep breath, her heart swelling with pride. This was the moment she had dreamed of for years, the chance to teach, to shape young minds, to give them the guidance she had once longed for. Her voice was calm yet strong as she explained a lesson, her students leaning forward to listen. Some scribbled notes furiously, others raised their hands with questions, and Amahle smiled patiently at each one, seeing not just children, but the future she wanted to protect. As the class ended, the children rose and thanked her, their laughter filling the room as they gathered their books. Amahle watched them go with warmth in her chest, realizing her journey had finally come full circle. From sweeping streets under ridicule to standing proudly as a teacher, she had transformed pain into purpose. Later that evening, as she walked home through the familiar streets, she passed a group of street cleaners in faded uniforms, their brooms moving in steady rhythm against the pavement. She stopped, smiling softly, and greeted them with respect. "Sani Bonani," she said warmly, nodding as if to honor their work. They looked up in surprise, then smiled back, touched by the gesture. For Amahle, those moments mattered deeply. She had once been in their shoes, mocked for the same broom, laughed at for the same uniform. She knew how heavy the silence of humiliation could feel, and she promised herself she would never forget where she came from. As she reached her doorstep, her brother ran to greet her, waving his school books proudly, and her grandmother's smile glowed from the doorway. Amahle looked up at the evening sky, gratitude filling her heart, because sometimes the world laughs at your work until your kindness makes them bow to your worth.